Hey, RetconRaider here. Well, we're just into 2020, and there's certainly no shortage of brand new games to talk about. Now, I just need to see if I can find enough time for them all. Though I suppose there are certainly worse problems to have. That said, today I thought we'd get things started by talking about the latest game to cross my radar. Today, I thought we'd take a quick look at Corruption 2029 by the Bearded Ladies. So, what is Corruption 2029? Well, at a glance, it's a brand new strategy game featuring a fascinating blend of both real-time stealth and turn-based tactical combat. It's a game that seems to draw heavy influence from the mechanics featured in Mutant Year Zero, Road to Eden, which certainly makes sense given that it's from the exact same development team. However, where Mutant Year Zero gave us a glimpse of a distant post-apocalyptic future, Corruption 2029 is set a little closer to the present. As the name implies, the game is set in the year 2029, presenting us with an alternate future where the United States is in the midst of a second civil war. Fractured into two feuding factions, the NAC and the UPA, both sides have escalated the conflict to such a degree that it now threatens to consume the entire nation. It's a world where military technology has literally transformed soldiers into little more than weapons of war. The UPA, for example, have taken to fielding cybernetic units, soldiers converted into remote-controlled killing machines, and equipped with technology that lets them turn invisible or makes them capable of other superhuman feats. Faced with these fearsome infiltrators, the NAC has grown violently paranoid in response, policing their own with increasingly draconian measures. The populace is carefully monitored for any signs of aberrant behavior, fed on a steady diet of propaganda and summary executions. All the while, the NAC continues to develop powerful new weapons of their own, some of which carry the grim promise of mutually assured destruction. In the midst of all this, the player is thrust into command of a small squad of the UPA's remote-controlled soldiers. Finding themselves stranded deep behind enemy lines after their dropship is shot down, they're guided by the voice in their ear, a UPA handler who is supposedly trying to put an end to the NAC's latest doomsday weapon. However, as they begin to cut a swath through the NAC's ranks, clues begin to emerge, hinting that at least some things might not be what they seem. From a gameplay standpoint, Corruption 2029 is pretty straightforward. It's a fairly conventional and intuitive, if somewhat streamlined, turn-based tactical strategy game. Drawing obvious inspiration from the recent XCOM games, it features both a square-based grid and a fairly mainstream two-action combat system. Attack resolution is entirely percentile-based, primarily operating in multiples of 25%, and damage is handled using a conventional hit point system, with 1-to-1 damage mitigation when attacking armored targets. Beyond that, the game also features a number of other staples of the turn-based tactical genre, including things like directional cover, multiple levels of elevation, and even destructible terrain. These all combine to create a fairly dynamic and interactive battlefield, where the player can perform a variety of cinematic actions, such as leveling terrain with explosives, smashing an opponent through a brick wall, or simply kicking them off of a tall building. Outside of combat, the player controls their squad in real time, allowing them to explore their surroundings and scout out enemy positions at their own pace. Enemies they encounter will often be guarding key positions, or patrolling specific routes, and it's up to the player to decide exactly how they want to approach them. While sheer overwhelming force is always an option, the game also features a fairly robust and intuitive stealth system, which the player can use to give themselves a fairly significant advantage. In Corruption 2029, every enemy has a clearly marked perception range, indicating the area that they can currently see. If the player enters one of these clearly marked areas, then the enemy will raise an alarm and combat will be triggered. This will also end up happening if the player doesn't exercise proper noise discipline, as certain actions, such as smashing an object or firing an unsilenced gun, will also alert any nearby enemies. However, clever players can use the in-game stealth system to carefully circumvent guards to potentially reach at least some of their goals without ever having to fire a shot. When that fails, the player can also use this system to set up carefully choreographed ambushes, allowing them to distract and then execute isolated enemies, or even booby-trap the battlefield with things like automated turrets or remote-triggered explosives. Now, it is worth noting that if you played Mutant Year Zero, then at least some of this probably sounds pretty familiar. Like I said, Corruption 2029 was in fact made by the same developers, and even seems to use an extremely similar gameplay engine. Most of the combat mechanics are almost identical to the ones featured in Mutant Year Zero, with a few new additions and general improvements to help keep things fresh. Where the two games differ, however, is in overall focus. While Mutant Year Zero played at being a fairly casual CRPG, Corruption 2029 does away with that pretense entirely, instead focusing almost exclusively on things like real-time stealth and tactical turn-based combat. The campaign is essentially broken down into 3 chapters, with each chapter being further divided into 7 distinct battle scenarios. Each of these scenarios is largely self-contained, though they are loosely linked by the overarching narrative. They're presented to the player in largely linear order, with only the occasional branching paths, and the player can freely abort or retry a scenario as often as they like. In fact, several of the scenarios even feature entirely optional challenges, many of which literally can't be accomplished the first time the player plays through that particular scenario. Where Mutant Year Zero tried to present its story in the form of cutscenes and various colorful NPCs, Corruption 2029 largely relies on basic mission briefings and the occasional voiceover. The player can discover more about the game's storyline by hacking computers, reading notes, or even eavesdropping on enemy conversations, but this is all purely optional content. It can provide some interesting context to the current in-game events, but it won't actually offer any concrete in-game rewards. For actual material rewards, the player will instead need to focus on completing the various scenarios. While they can discover basic items through exploration, this is primarily limited to things like grenades or medkits. However, successfully completing a scenario will often reward the player with a new weapon or cybernetic mod. Since the player's soldiers don't actually gain experience points or levels, these new pieces of equipment serve as the player's primary means of customizing and upgrading their squad. Each of the player's 3 soldiers can be equipped with up to 2 weapons and up to 3 cybernetic augments at a time, and their loadouts can be completely reset between each scenario. While this does mean that the player's soldiers are essentially blank slates, devoid of the quirky personalities featured in Mutant Year Zero, it also means that the player is granted a much wider degree of tactical flexibility. It's left entirely up to the player to determine what role each of their soldiers will play on the battlefield. This system actually boasts a fairly impressive amount of variety, and can lead to some rather intriguing and entertaining combinations. Silenced weapons, for example, are often weaker, but can be used for stealthy executions, while shotguns or heavy machine guns can be used to loudly but efficiently clear an entire room. Cybernetic legs can be used to leap across the entire map, or even jump kicking a pesky sniper off of his perch, while tactical shields can be used to temporarily render an exposed ally immune to incoming attacks. It is worth noting that while I haven't actually beaten the game, it does look like Corruption 2029 boasts a fairly short campaign. I powered through the entire first chapter in a little under 4 hours, which means that if the game is only 3 chapters long, then you'll probably end up finishing it in about 10 to 15 hours. Though, like I said, many of the optional challenges are clearly designed to lure you into replaying those scenarios a few extra times. That might tag an extra 5 to 10 hours onto your overall playtime. It's also worth noting that it does make heavy use of recycled maps. Of the 7 scenarios in the first chapter, roughly half of them involve revisiting maps that you've probably already visited. While the developers do tend to add some extra enemies to fight and some new items to discover, it can end up feeling a bit too redundant at times. So, all that said, would I personally recommend Corruption 2029? Well, that's a somewhat tricky question, but I will say that I have enjoyed playing it, and I do plan on playing it more in the future. Overall, it's hard not to compare Corruption 2029 to its predecessor, Mutant Year Zero, but both games excel in their own particular areas. Mutant Year Zero straddled the line between a somewhat quirky RPG and a fairly streamlined tactical game, while Corruption 2029 instead boasts an admittedly drier, though still intriguing, storyline with a heavier focus on individual handcrafted combat scenarios. I would say that if you enjoyed the combat portion of Mutant Year Zero, then Corruption 2029 is basically a no-brainer. It delivers the same style of streamlined, fast-paced, turn-based tactics, with a healthy dose of real-time stealth on the side. I would also recommend it if you enjoyed the newer XCOM games, but are looking for something a little faster and simpler to help whet your appetite while you wait for them to announce XCOM 3. I think it's fair to say that while Corruption 2029 might not offer the most in-depth tactical experience, it's still a rather solid and enjoyable game. The developers obviously had a lot of fun coming up with interesting scenarios to challenge the players with, and interesting toys for the player to use while playing through those scenarios. The game is pretty to look at, the action is fun to watch, there are a few typos, but the voice acting is all competently delivered. Honestly, that's more than I can say for a lot of the other games that I end up playing. So, yeah, I'd recommend the game for anyone who's looking for a casual and well-presented tactical experience. It's not the best game or the most tactically complex, but what's there is pretty decent. It's just important to make sure you know what you're getting yourself into. Anyway, as always, you certainly don't have to take my word for it. If you think that Corruption 2029 looks like the sort of game that you might enjoy, then I strongly encourage you to go check it out for yourself. You can find out more about the game by checking out the official Facebook page, the official Twitter feed, or by visiting the official store page over on Epic Games. As always, links are in the description.